Let's talk about our first genus of Australopiths, genus Australopithecus. Buckle up, because we have a lot to talk about. I'm probably going to regret this. So, we're talking about genus Australopithecus, and there's a couple different species we're going to talk about. We're going to start with Australopithecus anamensis, then we'll discuss Australopithecus afarensis, then Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus garhi, and lastly Australopithecus sediba. So, let's get started. Our first one here is Australopithecus anamensis. So if we can look in our tree here, you can see that is the very first of our blue Australopithecus species. This guy is about 4.2 to 3.9 million years old, and we find him in East Africa, both in Kenya and Ethiopia. You can see there's a bunch of sites that are right next to each other. Here's what we have. So here we have some maxilla and mandibular fragments. Look at those molars. Those are nice and big, but notice the tooth row is still kind of long. The incisors are a little bit smaller. We don't really have a good canine here, but let's look at some of our other photos. We do also have some post-crania. We have about 20 individuals here. Of course, they're fossils, so they're a little bit fragmentary. But from the post-crania we have some pretty good evidence that they are bipedal. That tibia is nice straight up and down. If you look at that ankle joint, that is very flat. So we have some pretty unambiguous evidence that these are strongly bipedal individuals. Here are some better specimens. So you can see that femur have a nice long neck to that femur, also a nice round femoral head. Could be a little bit larger. Modern humans have a larger femoral head, but overall that looks like a decent bipedal specimen, even if it's a little bit smaller than we are today. If you look at those teeth, now we have a nice example of a canine. So it is bigger than what we have today, but it is much smaller than a chimp. And also notice how blunt it is. That does not look like it has a CP3 honing complex with a premolar on the lower part of the jaw. So again, that is changed in the direction of modern humans. And remember, that is an autapomorphy that modern humans have. So when we're considering this fossil species, that is a synapomorphy with humans. And that's pretty good evidence that it's our ancestor and not anyone else's. Australopithecus anamensis is really not particularly interesting in its own right. It's the most interesting in the fact that it is the ancestor to the much better known Australopithecus afarensis. So here we have a nice time series, and we're showing a couple different sites. So anamensis is at Kenapoi and Alia Bay. And then we have later sites at Laetoli and Hadar that are Australopithecus afarensis. And what we actually see as a really nice time series is that the early ones in Kenapoi are a little bit more primitive, then Alia Bay is a little bit more derived, Laetoli is a little bit more derived, and then Hadar is more derived than that. So we actually have an Australopithecus anamensis. They are hypothesizing that it is one of the examples of anagenesis in the fossil record and not punctuated equilibrium. So it is actually just one lineage over time that's gradually changing in a direction. It's possible that it could be an example of cladogenesis rather than anagenesis, but right now people think it is an example of anagenesis or phyletic evolution. I highly recommend you check out this paper if you want to learn more. But really, we're here to talk about Australopithecus afarensis. This species is the most famous. It's where Lucy is. And we have so much more material. That's one of the reasons why we talk about it a lot, because we just have more data to go off of. So let's look back at our tree here. Part of the reason we have more data is it seems to have lived for a longer period of time. So let's talk about her. So this guy lived from about 4 to 3 million years ago. We find them in Ethiopia and also Tanzania. But let's start with the most famous of our specimens, Lucy. And the discovery of Lucy is what kicked off our discussions of Australopithecus afarensis in the first place. So she was discovered in 1974 by Don Johansson. You can see him pictured here. Sorry, I'm actually not quite sure which one he is and who the other guy is. Some paleontologist from the 70s. Thank you. Lucy is fun because she is a well, not formally associated. There's a bunch of bones that looked about the same size, and they thought they belonged to the same individual that were near each other. So they're like, hey, I think we can fit together. Oh, look, they do fit together quite well. It's kind of funny that Lucy's not actually a formally associated skeleton. associated means like we find them like and they're all together and look like it would be in life, and we're like, oh yeah, that's definitely the same individual. And Lucy actually wasn't, but close enough, and she works. Um, but you can see we have a fairly large amount of her skeleton. She's 40% complete. And I know 40 is less than half, but that's still a lot for the fossil record here. She is super short. She would be about 3.5 feet tall, and pretty light, so probably about 65 pounds is our latest estimate. She has relatively short legs, but from what we can see, she does have some pretty good evidence of bipedality. She has that angled femur. She has a really straight tibia, even though she is just kind of short. But let's take a moment and talk about how fossil species are named. So we have a couple of different things going on here. We have a holotype and then a paratype. Everything is based off the holotype when we're talking about a species. For living species, this works too, but living species are much easier to identify. When we're talking about fossil species, like we have a fossil and we're like, okay, this is our reference and everything for this species has to go off of this reference. And then we have paratypes. Those are essentially supporting evidence. So they're like, okay, here's our holotype, and then we'll assign all of these paratypes. Like we think these are also this species. So here are a couple specimens that we now consider Australopithecus afarensis. Which one do you think is the holotype? If you were going to name this species, which specimen would you call the holotype? In my humble opinion, I choose the near the 40% complete articulated skeleton. But no. When Don Johansen named Australopithecus afarensis, he actually chose the mandible from someone else's site to be the holotype of his species. Why? Because he wanted to poke fun at the Leakeys and be like, hey, you missed a species that was in your assemblage. So why is LH4 the holotype? Because he's a dick. But let's talk about the species. As you can see, we just have a lot of material for Australopithecus afarensis. So here we just have all different parts of it. Like we have a little bit of the skull cap, we have some mandibles, we have some vertebra. I see a sacrum there. I see some long bones. There's just so much to go off of. AL333, we consider this the first family. We don't actually know if they were a family, but we use this term because we see a variety of different sizes of individuals. We have adults and children. These guys are from Hadar. But let's start comparing some of our features here. So here we have the palate of a chimp, Australopithecus afarensis in the middle, and then a modern human. So you can see, in many ways, Australopithecus afarensis is kind of in the middle. That's good. Notice their molars, though. Their molars are larger than chimps, very big molars. Though, overall the tooth row is smaller, canine's a little bit smaller, but we do still see these parallel tooth rows. And you can see we have a nice parabolic palate and tooth row when we get to modern humans. And these are some of the things we're going to look for when we're talking about hominins. If we see big molars, that's a hominin. And we actually still have relatively thicker layers of enamel on our teeth relative to chimpanzees, and that's something we retain from our Australopith ancestors here. We, of course, have a couple other specimens to talk about. Here is the Dakika baby, nicknamed Salam. One thing we like to do in paleoanthropology is give the most important specimens nicknames. So that's where we have Lucy, this one's Salam. This one was discovered by Zarine Alemsaged, who also was voted the sexiest paleoanthropologist. I'm very confused or curious, like, how does he feel about that? And maybe he'd prefer to be better known for his discovery of the Dakika baby. And the baby here was of course found in Ethiopia. And we think she or he is about 3 years old. One cool thing we did do, since technology is getting better and better, is someone decided to CT scan this specimen so you can actually see the baby or the adult teeth that are forming in the maxilla and mandible there. And that's one of the reasons they were able to guesstimate the age here. And of course, someone has done a reconstruction of the Dakika baby. The hair, of course, is artistic license. This particular reconstruction looks a little bit like an orangutan to me, but at least it's a happy baby. As we mentioned before, there are a lot of different material for Australopithecus afarensis. So here we are comparing Lucy, the smallest specimen we have, at about 3.5 feet tall, to Katanumu. It means big man, because this one is 5'5". That's actually about my height, but this is one of the tallest specimens we have for Australopithecus afarensis. So we're seeing there's a pretty decent amount of sexual dimorphism in this species when we're seeing this amount of size difference. Lucy is actually one of the shortest specimens we have found. So in some ways, she's actually not a great example for this species because she is just so much shorter than many of the others. But so far we've been talking about their morphology. And there's, of course, a lot of information we can get from morphology, but it's hard to really know what happened. And the question here is, of course, how did Australopithecus afarensis move? Were they actually walking bipedally? Do our assumptions match what we see from all of their bones? The answer is probably, because we have the Laetoli footprints. These are from Tanzania. We have 2 adults and 1 child walking. The cool part about footprints is this is fossilized behavior. This is very different from the evidence of bones. And how people have been analyzing these footprints is looking at the shape of them, so you get an idea of how the feet were actually held in life, but also the weight transfer pattern. So here you can see the difference in a footprint between a chimpanzee, the Australopithecus afarensis, and a modern human. So the modern human definitely has more of an arch there, but there is a little bit of an arch, and the big toe is fairly close to the others. It is, there's a little bit of a space there, but it is definitely very close to modern humans and much different from that chimpanzee where it has that divergent big toe. The Laetoli footprints are one of the most drawn depictions of what we think might have been happening. So some people think they were walking side by side. Some people think the female was trailing after the male because the female's footprints were a little bit deeper. Some think, oh, maybe she was pregnant. Try to avoid reading too much into it because remember, it's a fossil. There is only so much we are going to be able to tell. We do have a couple of foot bones that we have found with Australopiths. Of course, they are not associated with heads. And since they aren't associated with heads, it is really hard to tell which species. So that's why I'm just calling them Australopith feet and I'm not giving them a species name here. However, they were discovered at 3.5 million years ago in Ethiopia. So that's the same time and place as Australopithecus afarensis. So probably Australopithecus afarensis. You can see these guys were reconstructed as a little bit of an abducted hallux, so it's a little bit divergent. It's really not as far as our chimpanzees, but there does seem to be a little bit of variation going on here. And let's take a moment to talk about this guy here, Kenyanthropus platyops. So this guy was discovered from Kenya about 3.5 million years ago. You can see it is heavily deformed. It is in tiny little pieces, so tiny. Here's me, the discoverer. The name means flat-faced man from Kenya. And they're like, oh, look, its face is flat. It's a different face from Australopithecus afarensis. I'm going to name it a new genus. It's so important. It's a mess. I don't think this is Kenyanthropus platyops. I'm pretty sure this is Australopithecus afarensis. It is the same time and same place and really, really crushed. I think it's very limited what conclusions we can draw from this particular specimen. I personally will not believe that Kenyanthropus is a real thing until we find a second one. In my opinion, I would actually call both Kenyanthropus platyops and Australopithecus barrel-ghazali just different specimens of Australopithecus afarensis. Australopithecus barrel-ghazali is simply another skeleton that was found in Chad at the same time. So it's a slightly different geographical origin, but it looks pretty similar. So probably just Australopithecus afarensis. But this is one of the hard parts about the fossil record. It's hard to really know. We can't go back and check. And this is one of the reasons why different people have different opinions, because we'll look at the data that is very fragmentary, and people will draw slightly different conclusions. Another important thing to talk about are the Lomekwian tools. So these guys are found about 3.3 million years ago in Kenya from the site of Lomekwi in West Turkana. They are big and heavy. They're not very sophisticated. And the sad part is they aren't actually associated with any fossils, so we cannot tell for certain who made them. To give you an idea of just how big they are, yeah, that's very big. You can use it as a tool, but it's heavy. It's not going to be particularly fine. We're going to talk more about stone tools later, but you can see as time goes on, stone tools do get smaller and more sophisticated. I highly recommend you check this one out. Check out the original paper talking about these tools. They are found at the same time and place as Australopithecus afarensis, so they are probably the species who made them. But again, it's just hard to tell unless we find the stone tools very clearly associated with a specific species. But let's talk about our next guy, Australopithecus africanus. So going back to our tree here, now we're talking slightly later in time, and we're in a new place. Now we're talking about South Africa. East Africa is a wonderful place to dig up fossils. There are lots of volcanic layers that you can date. It's easy to get nice dates. It's just clean. South Africa is not that. South Africa has a bunch of limestone caves, and limestone caves do things like this. So water will seep in, they'll make a hole, more water will seep in. Now you get this little tunnel thing. We call those death traps, because when you have that tunnel, species will just, fall in and then they die. But that's why we find a bunch of fossils all at one place, because a bunch of things fell into the death trap. But because we have a bunch of things falling into this hole and water's continually seeping in, it ends up looking like this. We call it Breccia. It's fossils in cement. It's the worst thing to excavate. I never want to deal with Breccia ever in my life. And props to the people who deal with this stuff, because that just looks like a nightmare to me. It is solid and fossils are delicate. It is hard to get them out safely. And also because you just have different organisms tumbling on top of each other, it's really hard to date and figure out what's associated with what. So yeah, this is one of the trickiest things to excavate. The caves, of course, are beautiful. And here is Sterkfontein, one of the more famous ones. But let's talk about our fossil here. So Australopithecus africanus, it was lived about 3 to 2 million years ago in South Africa. And you can see it's fairly similar to Australopithecus afarensis. There's a few differences. Its face is a little bit less prognathic. It has a little bit smaller brow ridge. I think its brain is a little bit larger, but overall very similar. Australopithecus africanus was actually discovered first by Raymond Dart. And this is the first one that was found, actually, the Tong child, or Tong 1. Here is Lee Berger holding it. And you might notice he's holding it next to a hawk there. Why is he doing that? But first, let's talk a little bit more about Tong here. So you can see with Tong, we have a face, but we also have an endocast of its brain. Its brain is about the same size as a chimpanzee, so nothing really special there going on. But this guy is 3 years old. And when you look in the eye orbits, there's some very diagnostic kind of scrape marks going on. These scrape marks are what you see when a big bird of prey eats something. So unfortunately, this toddler was eaten by some gigantic bird. Thank you for your sacrifice. We have learned a lot. I'm very sorry. Let's talk about maybe a nicer or happier specimen here. This is actually one of my personal favorite fossils, Mrs. Plus, or STS5. I don't know why I like her so much. She's just like pretty. Just like her face is very nice. You can see she has these nice wide cheekbones. She's unfortunately missing all of her teeth, but otherwise she's fairly complete. And I don't know, she just looks pretty to me. There's, of course, been many different reconstructions here, so Mrs. Plus looks pretty happy in this one. We also have some postcrania. So here's STS14. So we have a nice vertebral column, some ribs, a pelvis, and a femur. So that femoral head looks nice and round. That pelvis is more squat, got that curvature in our iliac blades. And as technology gets better and better, people are CT scanning all these skulls and putting them into computer models. So we can do, more sophisticated things without handling the fossils themselves, because fossils are fragile. You want to be very careful what you're doing when you're touching the actual fossils. So here we have Mrs. Plus and the Tong child. We can look at some of their teeth. Again, really big molars. Relatively small incisors, but we're still seeing those kind of long parallel tooth rows in their mandible. Oh, here's another rendition here. It's always fun to look at what people create. Of course, you want to take them with a grain of salt because we don't really know what they look like. And the hair, that is definitely artistic license. One of the theories that has come up several times when we're talking about Australopithecus africanus is the idea of man the hunter. This was actually originated by Raymond Dart, the discoverer of the Tong child, and he called it osteodontocheratic culture because he was finding all of these hominin fossils and then just mandibles of other species. And this was also, Robert Ardrey had his killer ape theory, and it, inspired many things. If you're not familiar with this specific image, this is actually from Space Odyssey 2001. I think it's really cool how this movie was actually listening to the scientific literature and incorporating that into its movie. Unfortunately, we no longer think that's what's happened. It's probably man the hunted. So there are actually several skulls with some big old bite marks, which match up really well with the teeth of saber-toothed tigers or jaguars. And what jaguars like to do is they kill something, they will climb a tree, and they will eat it. And then frequently, as they're eating it, parts will fall off, and then they could fall into these little death traps. Remember how these limestone caves work. So that is probably what is happening with these guys. We also have another important specimen, Littlefoot. So this is SCW 573. It's probably about 2.8 million years ago. Again, these guys are super hard to date based on just the geology of our caves here. The discoverers want to name a new species, Australopithecus prometheus, though I don't think this has been finalized. The cool thing, though, about Littlefoot is they noticed that the tibia was broken off, and so they went back into the caves and they found the rest of this individual. So I believe they are still in the process of excavating this guy. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more to say about Littlefoot someday. But excavation in the Breccia, it's not quick. And honestly, I'd prefer they go slow and get it right than go quickly for this guy. Let's talk about our next species. Now we have Australopithecus garhi. So here's how he looks. This is about 2.6 to 2.5 million years ago. We're going back to East Africa. Now we're back in Ethiopia. Garhi in the local dialect means surprise, because nobody expected to find a new species here. Everybody was very confused. So garhi is a little bit weird. They have larger teeth, larger than other Australopithecus, and it's also fairly prognathic. And the other weird thing about this guy is Australopithecus garhi was maybe associated with some stone tools. Maybe it's an ancestor of Homo. My personal favorite theory is maybe it's a female Paranthropus aethiopicus. We haven't talked about this species yet, but we will soon, because notice they have this similar trigonid or triangle shape on their forehead there. Unfortunately, we don't have that much for this particular species here, so there isn't much we can say. But I think they named it fairly well because we're not quite sure what's going on. But let's talk about our last and probably my favorite species of the Australopithecus here, Australopithecus sediba. So now it's the very last species. And here is a picture of Lee Berger. His son actually discovered the first specimen. So this is fairly younger than all the other Australopithecus species. So we're at 2 million years, again in South Africa in the site of Malapa. And this was discovered relatively recently, and it took up an issue of science because they found so much material. And it's one of the more exciting finds in the last decade or so. So Malapa is another one of those limestone cave sites with all of these death traps. If you personally ever decide to go to South Africa, be careful yourself. Like these are still there. So we have a bunch of skeletons here kind of submerged in some of these traps. Here to my friends, they got to go. I'm a little jealous of that. But, I get to go see tarsiers in Indonesia, so it's fine. So one of the reasons sediba is so cool is we have found a couple of nearly complete skeletons. So we have a lot of material with them, and that's why people are researching them a lot, because there is so much we can say when we have this much material. So here, I'm pretty sure we have an adult female and then a juvenile male. Some people like to hypothesize that maybe it's mother and child. And because we do have some relatively complete skeletons, we can make some estimations of body size and compare them to other species. So here we have a chimp, Lucy, Australopithecus sediba, and then some later species, Homo erectus, and of course us. So you can see Australopithecus sediba is still relatively chimp-like. Short legs, long arms. Overall, fairly similar to Lucy. The cranium is a little bit more gracile. Still has that really wide rib cage going on. Just kind of big lower body, small cranium. But let's look a little bit more at that cranium. We have again CT scanned it, trying to get an idea of what that brain might be. Still overall pretty small, but notice its face is smaller. It's not terribly prognathic. Looking at the pelvis here, Australopithecus afarensis, it does have that nice curved pelvis, but it's very, very wide. Australopithecus sediba, it's not quite as wide and is a little bit more derived and a little bit more human-like there. We can also look at their hands. Keep in mind it is actually missing the distalmost phalanx on each finger, so that it's going to look shorter than it actually is. But just look how tiny and adorable it was. These guys were not particularly big. So there is, of course, a lot coming out about Australopithecus sediba. I highly recommend you read up on this species because it is newly discovered. But we talked about a lot. There are several different species we discussed: anamensis, afarensis, africanus, garhi, and sediba. So anamensis, it's really only important because it's the ancestor to Australopithecus afarensis. It's the earliest one. Afarensis, it's Lucy. We talk about it a lot because there's a lot of different material. There's also the Laetoli footprints, and lots of different size variation, many different specimens we can look at. Africanus, that's the Tong child in Mrs. Plus, so that's our first species that it lives in South Africa. It's a little bit younger than afarensis and is probably descended from afarensis. Australopithecus garhi, who knows? We need more specimens, and we also need to do a little bit more research to compare them to other species to really figure out what's going on here. And Australopithecus sediba, this one is young, new, and cool, and we do have a lot of information, so there's a little bit more that we can say there. And Australopithecus sediba, is very closely related to some other early Homo specimens. It's also important to remember who lives where. So these guys all live in East Africa, and these other two are in South Africa. We talked about a lot of names, so I highly recommend that you go and check out the Smithsonian page on what does it mean to be human. They have a really nice list where you can look at different species, and that will help remind you what's going on with each of them. Also highly recommend you read this paper by Lee Berger about the mosaic nature of Australopithecus sediba, so you can get a better understanding of this new find and why it's so exciting. So can you explain? What are the different species of Australopithecus, and what features do they have?